the things that he's saying.
What, a single-party state? He's not proposed to abolish British democracy. That's absurd.
Okay. Is Nigel Farage a fascist? I do feel like this is kind of one of those uncomfortable kind of like gotcha questions that actually has a more complex or a little bit more of a nuanced answer than I think what often you're able to deliver in like a teeny tiny little segment on friggin' LBC or whatever. I do think if you watch that whole clip from LBC, you know, I think the idea that obviously like fascism will just sort of like name itself directly and say, this is what we are and this is what we're about. That's kind of grossly naive. So I don't think for something to be fascistic, it has to kind of bear all of the hallmarks and be kind of very explicitly, obviously fascist in order for it to be fascistic in nature. Do I think Nigel Farage is a fascist? I think the answer is a little bit complicated, but also not really that complicated. I think Farage definitely has streaks of authoritarianism in his thinking and in the policies he supports. That doesn't necessarily make him unique necessarily in our political life anymore. You know, I think we've seen streaks of authoritarianism, for example, from Keir Starmer's Labour Party and the kind of crackdown, the prescription of Palestine Action, for example. We've seen authoritarianism embraced certainly by the Tories as well, with the kind of heightening of policing powers over the years. And Nigel Farage is in line with some of that stuff. I do also think that the rhetoric around migrants that Nigel Farage and Reform UK in particular deploy isn't just on the basis of kind of like, oh, well, there's just a few too many people in the country and we need to reduce numbers so that the NHS can work properly or so more people can have more houses. It's not really done on purely a numbers basis. There is a kind of much more sinister justification, which is to say, well, actually, these people aren't like us. And there are scary men trying to come in here who want to assault our women and, you know, damage the kind of moral fabric of our society. And so that language it's not really anymore about numbers of people and about a kind of balance sheet of like, oh, okay, like there's too many people in and we can't support all these people. It then becomes about the kind of moral and ethical nature of these people, and it becomes about dehumanizing those people and saying, well, actually, these people, they're not actually people. And I do think there is something fascistic about that kind of language that's deployed. I think it was Lord Heseltine said something very similar recently as well when he was interviewed by the BBC and challenged on this idea of whether Nigel Farage is a fascist. Do I think Nigel Farage is a kind of pure fascist? Not necessarily, but I think the most important thing to understand about Nigel Farage is that he is potentially a gatekeeper to fascism. One thing that I think is worth noting about Nigel Farage is that you will see him go off on Twitter or in press conferences or whatever, having a go at his political enemies all the time. You know, he'll have pops at Keir Starmer, he'll have some pops at the left. You know who we never see him have a pop at? The people to the right of him. We very rarely ever see Nigel Farage critique Tommy Robinson. And, you know, I'm sure there are some elements of what Tommy Robinson says and what he does that Nigel Farage may not like. He may find Tommy Robinson at times, I'm sure, a bit unsavoury. But Nigel Farage is making a political calculation in his head. And that calculation is, basically, if I allow these people to the right of me to keep talking, keep saying the incendiary things that they're saying, that will normalise me and my positions, and I will start to look more moderate and I will start to look more reasonable. And so he understands that by moving the conversation more and more to the right, including to the real fringes and extremes of the right, that helps him politically to get where he wants to get to, into number 10. He's made a calculation. So Nigel Farage may himself not be a fascist, or it may be far too early to tell, you know, whether or not this is someone who's going to embed fascistic policies potentially into this country if he gains power. But he is an ally, certainly, in many respects, to some very unsavoury people who are quite clearly fascistic in nature. His allegiances to Donald Trump also, again, sort of suggest something quite similar as well. You know, Donald Trump, I think, is someone who has shown a real desire potentially for things like a one-party state. It's certainly not beyond the imagination to imagine that Donald Trump might be very interested in a more sort of permanent basis of power beyond regular elections. And of course, famously, he contests the results of the 2020 election, and then we get the insurrection. So maybe for now it's best not to get too caught up in, you know, is this guy definitely a fascist or not? There's so much baggage around some of that terminology, and for different people it will mean different things as well. But there can be no doubt whatsoever that the politics of Farage is absolutely a gatekeeper to some nastier stuff. And I think that's really the sticking point that we should be thinking about.